I'm continuing with my education on housing now, talking to Martin Pawley. And the word that comes to mind is garbage. Why does that come to mind?
Well, probably because I've been writing and lecturing about garbage housing for 5 years. It's a sort of key word, and I'm not 100% certain that it expresses what I thought it expressed a couple of years ago. Basically, garbage housing is a way of describing building with waste materials. The underlying idea being that we live in a society that produces waste materials in enormous volume, and we live in a society which has a shortage in terms of housing. And that those waste materials, if you analyze their constituents, are things like steel, glass, plastics, aluminium, fiber-based products and so forth, which are all by definition building products. Now, my view of it, and I'll state it simply at the beginning, is that if there is a way to transform by design, by the design process, that waste material into usable building material, then you can feed a surplus into a shortage, and greatly...
Yeah, but the shortage of housing is not necessarily due to the shortage of building materials.
No, the shortage of housing in the present time is, it's not directly related to shortages of building materials, you're right, but it's related to the extremely low productivity of the building industry. Now, that's a central point which many people ignore. And to make it clear, for instance, if we compare the productivity of the automobile industry or the consumer durable industries with the housing industry, we'll see. For example, if in this country, by some magic, all the television sets disappeared overnight, they could be replaced within 6 years on annual production. Now, if that happened to housing, it would take 64 years to replace them. That's an index of how our mode of providing housing is quite different from our way of providing other industrial products. And the basic element, the real center of the housing problem, in my view, lies in that failure of productivity. The building industry cannot produce at the rate that industrial production can work.
They would claim that it was shortage of land that inhibits them from producing.
Well, if you consider political realities as they are at the moment, the shortage of land is merely a function of a number of administrative delays. There is no reason why land cannot be made available. There is no absolute shortage of land in this not even in this country, and we're very densely populated. The shortage of land is an expression of an economic situation and a bureaucratic system of control. It's not a real shortage.
There again, shortage of money also would be another thing that would mute.
Well, shortage of money depends on what things cost. If we produced television sets the way they were produced in 1938, they probably cost £2,000 each. Now that is, in effect, we produce houses the way they were built in 1838, and they do indeed cost something like 20,000.
So your strategy for using waste materials is basically to make houses cheaper and thereby increase productivity.
Basically, what I think is necessary is that the relationship between the consumer industries, the ones that produce consumer durables, cars and all that sort of thing, the relationship between the consumer industries and housing must be changed. At the moment, housing is an economic pawn in the consumer game. If you're an owner-occupier, you can access the increased value of your house, use the money you get from the increased value to buy consumer goods. Now, what I would like to do, or what I think must be done, is to integrate the housing effort with the whole process of consumer production. That is, to shift the resource base of housing away from its present specialist, building materials, craftsman orientation, into the consumer industry. So it's a function of secondary use products within the consumer industry.
The move towards housing in the public sector is obviously, in that sense, working against you in that way. I mean, you want to see housing more a part of industry and commerce and less a part of the public sector? Or
well, indeed. It's a misnomer to talk about housing moving in the public sector. It's paralysed in the public sector. Costs have increased enormously. There are cases in the papers every day. Hillingdon Borough Council spend £230,000 buying 6 houses, which they then knock down and replace with 4 garages. And that's a silly, spectacular example, but there are cases where the GLC, in real terms, for instance, when it rehabilitates a house, 2/3 of the cost is overheads of the GLC, and only 1/3 is actually the cost of rehabilitation. The whole process of municipalization, which is really an ancient political idea, 60, 70 years old, removing the private landlord altogether, buying him out by the local authorities, is utterly ruinous. The cost of the public housing program has become intolerable and impossible. They're literally in the, for instance, in the sort of, if you like, if what's at the top end of the public sector market, which is housing societies and housing associations, they're actually cheating in financial terms because the cost of developments has become so high that they are it's no longer possible to defray them on a housing revenue account. That is to say, the people living in the developments can no longer afford to pay for them. What the Housing Corporation does now is write off 60 or 80% of the cost against capital account and not revenue, which means that they're just printing money to build the houses. They're cheating.
Yeah. It means, to your mind, houses have got to be built cheaper. You see that as the only possible solution.
Yes, because the current economics of housing are unworkable. You only have to project them forward from the present extremely dangerous situation. Just project them at present rates of increase through for 5 or 10 years, and you'll see that it's utterly impossible. It cannot go on like this. Furthermore, you can compare, as I've done, with the car prices. Now, people think car prices are incredible now. They've gone up amazingly in a year. But if you take the car, I want to leave aside any argument about whether it's fair to compare a car and a house, but take the car as a complicated, high-performance industrial product and compare it with a house in terms of cost, just to get some idea. When we will accept for a start that productivity in the motor industry is 5 times higher than in the construction industry.
Productivity on what basis?
Per unit. They can produce 5 times as many units in a given time as
per any given time,
yeah.
not per man or per pound.
Oh, indeed, per man as well. You can express it in different ways. It's even more dramatic. The increase in value over the cost of ingredients, if you like, what it costs raw materials to go into put into the motor industry and what the product is worth when it comes out, the increase in value is enormous. It's far greater than in the construction industry. But I don't think anyone would argue with that. What I wanted to point out was if you take the decade 64 to 74, which I did for purposes of comparison, take the cheapest 30 cars on the British market in October 1964, that would be 30 cars under £1,000, and see what happened to those cars or their equivalents by 1974, by October 1974. Their price had in fact increased by 196%. Now, you can take off 100% because the purchasing power of the pound fell, in fact, by that amount during that period. So, in effect, you got a situation where cars had, it's not 1992, cars got actually 8% cheaper in real terms between 64 and 74. Now, those are incredible figures, but they're substantiated by Treasury and government publications. They actually got 8% cheaper in real terms between 64 and 74, whereas houses increased by 300% over the same period. And I think all this is a function of the low productivity in the building industry, on the one hand, the use of the house as an investment, as a pawn in an economic game on the other, and really it all boils down to the fact that we cannot produce houses in volume, and we don't get the advantages of a scale effect in mass production, so they're ludicrously high priced for various reasons.
I saw a figure recently, apropos of that, which claimed that the average man's car now cost him more than the average man's house.
Yes, I know the figures you mean. Yes, this is true if you consider running costs as well. Now, of course, an enormous increase in the cost of oil, petrol, products of that kind, and increase in administrative cost of running a car, and license insurance and so forth. That's true.
Do you think that reflects the kind of values which society places on house and car?
No, I don't. I think I think the figures need to be. Well, no, let's take that back. If you elaborate that, what do you mean reflects the value? You think people think their cars are more important than their houses?
But it would seem that way from that figure, that they do in fact, spend a sizable portion of their income on.
Well, of course, there is a tendency. It's nowhere more evident than in this wretched city to regard the car as some kind of useless luxury. It's really just hurled into the city to block up everybody else's traffic and strangle public transport, whereas of course it's absolutely essential for most people's way of life. Furthermore, the actual costs of running a car have to be really analysed carefully, because 40% of the private cars registered in this country are company cars, and so a lot of those costs are lost in company expenses.
It's as high as that?
40%. Yeah. I mean, I feel very bad about driving a 5-year-old Volkswagen as being a certain sign of failure, and I was quite relieved to discover that at least it was mine and didn't belong to the AA.
Incidentally, do you live in a garbage house?
Of course not. It's almost impossible to live in a garbage house. There's only one garbage house in the sense that I'm talking about it. in existence, and that's in Holland. So I want to clarify that. When I said at the beginning that garbage housing is an ambiguous term in relation to what I mean, I used to think it was an excellent term because it combined a pejorative term, garbage, with a value term, house. But really, I see it as essentially a design approach that's very important to understand, that you can design consumer containers and packaging in such a way that when their first use is finished, they have an undamaged potential for second use as construction materials, which gives you certain advantages. One, the cost of producing a building element such as a brick, we'll compare a bottle with a brick. The cost of producing this brick is covered by its function as a container, A. Its distribution, to a great extent, is covered by the distribution cost of the product it contains, which is to say that you're using a consumer distribution network, which takes the product from where it's manufactured, fills it with something, distributes it to your supermarkets all over the country. You're using that as a carrier for building materials. In effect, you're offloading an enormous amount of the cost of building materials by doing that. And of course, furthermore, I mean, what's most important and what some viewers may not know is the enormous disparity in production figures between these things. We're talking in the case of bottles. And bottles already, even without redesign, are very close to the strength requirement for bricks. It only needs a small alteration to the design to make them as strong as bricks. Bottles are produced in something like 8 times the volume per year of bricks. And the same runs through all these various packaging elements, cans and plastic containers and so forth. If you approach it as a design problem, you have enormous advantages. You use the consumer distribution network as a carrier, you defray part of the cost of producing the product, and there are curious advantages that only become evident as you examine the possibilities.
And as you say, you've been examining the possibilities for the last 5 years. There's one garbage house in existence. How close are we possibly to seeing some such ideas implemented on any scale whatsoever? Well,
not as close now as we were some time ago. The one garbage house that exists, the Heineken one, Heineken did a project redesigning bottles in 1960-65. That was, of course, before I even thought about the subject. So that's nothing to do with me. I did have a brief flowering period in 1972-3 where I was invited to go to Chile and talk about garbage housing there. And the Chilean Ministry of Planning sponsored a research project which I carried out at Cornell, based on the idea, even with the small consumer sector in the Chilean market at that time, that retrieval of certain packaging and containers, plus increases in production of bottles and cans as an indirect means of increasing supply of building materials, would see the possibilities of doing that. That program is quite a large part of the book Garbage Housing that's allegedly going to be published this month by Architectural Press.
Well, what sort of steps do you think would be necessary to implement some of that? I mean, presumably you are convinced that it would be a good plan to implement some of these things. How would you possibly go about it, and how do you make a thing like that happen?
Well, it's extremely difficult, and I'm not optimistic about it, because I think that what I'm talking about is a strategic change in the approach to housing, whereas what is going on nowadays is an endless fiddling with tactical details. There are a lot of people, housing administrators and politicians of one kind or another, who really, when the truth is told, like nothing better than a situation where there are 40,000 people on the waiting list and only 3,000 houses being produced a year. They just love arguing about who should get them and who should move out of big ones into small ones and so on, and they like to produce graphs, densities, mixes and all this stuff. And I really believe that is its utility is demonstrated by the present reality. The housing situation is getting worse and worse. What is wrong is the strategy, the actual relationship of construction and output of houses to consumer industries themselves. Now, how does one implement that? Because it's a very large and fundamental change. In my view, it's extremely difficult to do it unless you take some marginal sector of housing output where, if we like consumers in relation to housing, would be more amenable and more adaptable to it. My belief for some time was that student housing could be an excellent experimental ground for this type of work. And indeed, apart from the Chilean thing, which of course came to an end with the Allende government, the only other development that looked at it for any time as though it was going to start off was in Manchester, a student housing project in Manchester was going to be based on garbage housing. But it's extremely difficult for reasons that probably are clear already, which is to say, if I believe that efficient use of waste materials in this way is a function of redesign, then the redesign has to be carried out first. If you try to build houses out of unmodified cans, bottles and so forth, which is what I did at Cornell, you end up, I regret to say, with a fairly low performance product.
And also not cheap, I should imagine, if you're actually, if you're actually having to arrange for collection, etc., of all the materials, whereas if there isn't a network set up for doing it.
No, it's still incredibly cheap. You'd
It still
be surprised,
is.
yes. You can, we had half a dozen people working on the garbage housing project there. We had no problem in collecting anything we needed. And that was a small town, 8,000 population.
And you're not, you don't envisage, actually, if this kind of system was set up, you wouldn't envisage people living in what might be called substandard housing. I mean, they're not, you're not in fact asking people to live in,
On the contrary.
in huts made out of bottles and bits of tin cans.
No, I'm asking people, or proposing that people should live in a product as which I would compare with a motor car. A lot of people describe contemporary cars as junk, but in fact they're extremely efficient utilization. The weight of the average car has gone down enormously in the last 15 years. Enormously lighter materials go into it. The envelope itself is much thinner and so forth. I would regard a garbage housing product, in the way that I use the term, as sophisticated and responsive an environment as a car is. No reason why it shouldn't be as good, if not better.
What about the actual proportion of costs in housing that is represented by materials of the structure? Presumably some things like the servicing, the plumbing, the electricity, all the other services wouldn't vary that much in cost. I mean, you can't use second-hand electric plugs or second-hand plumbing, or the only contribution which the waste material is making is the actual building structure, if you like, the cladding, the walls, and how much is that significant in the total cost of the building?
Well, if we assume that all the carcassing was encompassed in that way, which is reasonable to assume, that would be 40%. I'm not including the cost of financing, because that's really the blockbuster. But
Yes.
my attack on the cost of financing would be by greatly reducing the price of the product itself. And of course I would sympathize with any attempt to remove the land speculation component from it altogether, which I'm convinced that this or a successive government will do very soon. So we'll take that out. So if we take carcassing, I'll assume that's around 40% of the cost. Now there are various approaches that could be taken to reducing the cost of servicing. There's a lot of interesting work being done, this is not specific to my work, being done in Cambridge, for instance, on autonomous servicing systems, not necessarily energy inputs, which I'm dubious, but more interestingly, I think, on drainage waste systems and so forth. There are considerable, when you examine it, there are a considerable number of possibilities in those areas which have not been carried out. To give you just one example, there's a system of drainage called rodding eye drainage, which doesn't use manholes. It was developed in the 50s. And it, of course, reduces the cost, because of the cost of laying bricks to make manholes, reduces the cost of a drainage system by 2/3. Now, it is demonstrated in tests in the 50s that manholes were, in fact, far from being a means of clearing out drains, were actually a source of blockages in drainage systems. Now, this is accepted, it's understood, but in our present mode of construction, with the total rule book system for instance, road networks and drainage networks, nobody is allowed to use rodding eye drainage. And I mentioned road networks, you've probably heard already with other people, it's the same thing. There's a mandatory system of road networks that requires housing estate roads to be built virtually to the standard of motorways. This is ludicrous, and it's something that under present arrangements can't be changed. But I think all that feeds back into what I said about a change in the strategic approach. This endless tinkering with details and printing money, which is what this really the whole of housing policy at the present time is doing. It's hopeless.
That tends to suggest, unfortunately, though, entering the political arena, which is what a lot of people get towards, is that they cannot implement anything or do anything without entering that particular arena.
Yeah, it's an odd business, I know, and it's despairing. For instance, you take this government, they have identified this so-called problem of under occupation, that is old ladies living alone in 4-bedroom houses and so forth. And the simple answer to that, of course, in a non-ideological sense, is to allow them to sublet. Now, if local authority tenants all over this country were allowed to sublet tomorrow, it would make a bigger dent in the so-called housing problem than anything that they can do by printing another £230,000 to buy a house down the road. it's political in that sense. But I would separate, I would separate the political implications of garbage housing from political implications for any state-controlled system of housing.
Yes,
What I'm talking
yeah.
about is something based on and carried out by the consumer industries.
And you're offering, in fact, a design solution
Yeah.
if the political framework is there to use it.
Let's take, just for the last time, take the motor industry. The motor industry presently is packing up shop because it can't sell its product. Now the motor industry is kitted, organized with design teams, with machine tools, everything organized for producing pressed metal shells. Now they could be houses. It's as simple as that. And where
Martin?
politics comes into that, I don't know.
Thank you very much.
Okay.